Welcome everyone to our session this afternoon. My name is Philip Hobson. I'm the rector of St. Martin in the Fields Church here in the Diocese of Toronto, an ecumenical officer for the diocese. And I'm the moderator for this particular session as we look forward to looking at our green shoots as they are sprouting across the church here in Canada. So we're looking at the national level this afternoon, and we have a number of people that are here with us to help us to look particularly at that. And so I'd like to introduce them. Scott Sharman, who is Reverend Dr. Scott Sharman is the animator for Ecumenical and Interfaith Relations for the Anglican Church of Canada. He's a priest in the Diocese of Edmonton and works mostly out of Edmonton, although before COVID, I think he moved around a bit more. And so is part of the faith, worship, and ministry team at the national office. And he has two colleagues who are assisting him in the presentation today. There's the Reverend Danielle, who is the rector at Holy Trinity Old Strathcona, which is an Anglican parish in Edmonton, and also the Reverend James Lavoy, who's the pastor at the Terrance Community Moravian Church in Edmonton. And then we also have with us today Dr. Ryan Weston, who is the lead animator for public witness for social and ecological justice at the national office for the Anglican Church of Canada. And so all of these individuals will be helping us to think about our green shoots and the ways of ecumenism across our country. And so I'm going to turn it over to Scott at this point. And just a reminder that if there will be questions after the two presentations, there will be time for questions, and you can put those questions in the Q&A, and hopefully we'll be able to address them later on in our session this afternoon. So I turn it over to Scott.
Thank you very much, Father Philip, for the welcome and introduction. Grace and peace, everyone, from Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton. And as we're speaking today about right relations among churches, may we do that mindful of the call from God to seek right relations with all of our relatives. What I'd like to do for my part of time that I have is to touch on four pieces of the landscape of the national dialogical ecumenical work on what you might call the faith and order side. And Ryan will cover more of the justice and peace side in a little bit. Now, I know some of the things I might have referenced, such as dialogue with the Roman Catholic Church or local ecumenical shared ministry, are being addressed in other sessions for the conference. So I won't mention those or everything that I could perhaps touch on, but I did want to say a few brief things about where we're at ecumenically with the United Church of Canada, with Mennonite Church Canada, and in the full communion partnership with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada. And I'll move through those three fairly quickly. And then fourthly, my colleagues Danielle and James will help me talk in more detail about emerging possibilities with the Moravian Church in Canada, which might be a new or a lesser known dialogue partner for many on the call today. So first, on the United Church. The Anglican Church of Canada re-established a national bilateral relationship with the UCC in 2003 after a hiatus of about 20 years or so following the challenges in that conversation in the late 1970s. And most will probably know fairly well that one of the ongoing friction points in this conversation has continued to be the inability to arrive at a mutual recognition of ministers and ministries. And that's due to varying understandings, of course, and convictions around ordination and the role of episcopacy in relation to it. And so in 2012, a new mandate and a new group was called together as the Anglican United Dialogue to focus specifically on those issues. And in late 2020, a report on that work was produced. And the title of that report was A Ministry of Unity, Further Reflections on Episcopae in the Anglican and United Churches in Canada. And I can't go into much detail on it here, but, and this probably won't be a spoiler alert, this document certainly didn't solve everything, far from it. However, drawing on some encouraging steps in Anglican Methodist and Anglican Reformed dialogues in other parts of the world that have seen mutual recognition of the ministries of episcopae or oversight, and also in light of some of the recent restructuring in United Church of Canada polity that took place in interesting ways in 2019 and 2020, this document does propose a way by which Canadian Anglicans, while retaining their own convictions about things like threefold ministry and the historic episcopate, could begin to see a little bit more easily how two new offices in United Church of Canada governance and leadership, called the Office of Vocation Ministers and the Regional Council Presidents, might be able to be seen as exercising at least some of the aspects of what Anglicans understand as the ministry of episcopae. Not in the same way, of course, but in kind of more diffused, collegial, communal sorts of ways. And this report goes on to even map out some further steps that might potentially be contemplated in the United Church of Canada for it to begin to see these ministries of episcopae operating within their system in more personal and more historic ways that Anglicans are used to looking for in our ecumenical partners, as well as suggesting some ways that Anglican structuring of the exercise of episcopal ministry could be reformed and renewed in light of some learnings from United Church convictions about conciliarity. And the report that I speak about here has come before judicatory bodies in the two churches in initial ways in these last 12 months or so. And as you can imagine, there have been some positive affirmations and lots of further questions. But this latest iteration of the Anglican United Dialogue has, I think, moved the needle on that conversation a little bit. And it's a report that I would commend to you, worth looking at on the anglican.ca website. A second highlight is a resolution that came to General Synod in 2016, which called for the creation of a new ecumenical partnership for the Anglican Church of Canada with Mennonite Church Canada. And this was interesting, not only because it was an opportunity to engage in a formal way with a new kind of conversation partner from the Free Church and a Baptist tradition, but also because this was the first time that the Anglican Church in Canada mandated the adoption of a specific model of dialogue, the model of receptive ecumenism for a national bilateral conversation. We've heard a little bit about that in some of the earlier sessions today. What that means, receptive ecumenism, is to engage in dialogue not for the sake of seeking agreement or union, but rather to focus on learning from the strengths of another church in ways that offer healing or fill up gaps or help us see blind spots in our own church. And of course, Anglicans and Mennonites work ecumenically with one another in lots of different ways in Canada, especially in the field of justice. But this was the first time that a more structured forum for reflecting on what the historical and doctrinal and spiritual gifts of each of those churches might have to share with one another. And just in these next couple of weeks ahead of us, the final touches are being put on a report from the 5 years of this journey, which a small group of Anglicans and Mennonites in Canada have been on together on behalf of those wider church communities. And I can tell you as a little bit of a sneak peek that one of the most exciting things that will be part of that report is a vision that the dialogue has discerned together for how each respective church might both challenge and build up the other, as both try to amend and repair for and from their unique experiences in relation to colonial Christendom and the colonial project that the churches got tied into, and the damaging effects that's had in wider Canadian society and on the churches themselves. And so stay tuned for announcements about that report, which is likely coming forward in July of this year. Thirdly, and lastly, before we transition to the Moravian focus, I want to say something about the Canadian Anglican Lutheran Full Communion relationship, now that we've just recently passed the 20-year anniversary mark. And I can definitely say that 20 years on, it's clear to me, at least, that full communion is something that's always capable of becoming fuller. And we're starting to see that full communion, if you will, in interesting sorts of ways in the life together of the Anglican Church of Canada and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada. There's lots of different things I could point at to illustrate that for you, but the one that I'm going to identify today is in connection with what I like to call the linking of full communions. It's been long assumed that the different kinds of contexts and polities of national and provincial churches of the Lutheran World Federation and the Anglican Communion at the global level would make it really hard for an Anglican Lutheran global communion relationship to ever take place. But in 2016, the Anglican Consultative Council, commenting on that challenge, had an idea about maybe approaching it in a new way that I think is interesting. It encouraged the North American and the British and Irish Anglican churches to explore ways that it might be possible to, quote, bring the existing national or regional agreements of full communion with Lutherans into relationships with each other, and then to see where that leads. Well, the two national agreements in North America have begun to move on that recommendation. And so in 2019, with resolutions from the Evangelical Lutheran Church's National Convention, the Anglican Church of Canada's General Synod, and the Lutheran Church in America's World Churchwide Assembly, 3 of the 4 churches in question have taken action to extend to one another a recognition of relations of full communion with their national and confessional opposite on the other side of the border, and to accept the communion agreement that was articulated in the other country as the basis for doing that. The Episcopal Church, which is the 4th in this grouping, expects to take action on that this summer as well. And the proposed name for this quadrilateral of communion, you could say, is Churches Beyond Borders. I think it's a pretty small step in the grand scheme of God's work and healing relationships, but it is indeed a step. And it's one that reopens conversations in new ways about other kinds of linkage possibilities between the North American quartet of churches and other churches of the Lutheran World Federation and the Anglican Communion. So that was a quick survey through 3 ongoing relationships at the national level. And I want to focus in more depth on a 4th. I like to call this one an example of ecumenical leveraging, in the sense of utilizing movement in one place to move other things in another place. So Lutherans and Anglicans have been involved in ecumenical conversations with the Moravian tradition for 300 plus years or so already. Moravians are a Reformed, Episcopal, and global church that has roots going back to the reforming movements in Europe in the 15th century. And in recent decades, the 3 traditions have seen in some places substantial steps taken towards mutually recognizing each other as churches, and even some full communion partnerships. In the United States, the following Our Shepherd into Full Communion Agreement from 1999 initiated full communion with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and the Moravian Church in North America. And in 2010, the Episcopal Church established full communion with American Moravians through a text called Finding Our Delight in the Lord. And in that latter document, right near the end, in a line that reads kind of like breadcrumbs that are laid out for future travelers, you can read the following. Both the Moravian Church in America and the Episcopal Church are members of global communions, and they offer the fruits of this dialogue to other conversations between Anglicans and Moravians worldwide, particularly to the Anglican Church of Canada and the Canadian district of the Moravian Church in America. So they might as well have put that in bold and all caps. Pay attention to this, do some ecumenical leveraging. In Canada, Moravian congregations and missions exist in 3 civil provinces, Newfoundland and Labrador, Ontario, and Alberta. And in each of those regions, Moravian relationships with Anglicans or Lutherans or both have existed mostly on the level of just kind of occasional friendly contact, but especially with that linkage I mentioned a moment ago between the Canadian and American Anglican Lutheran full communion agreements, the question of what other full communion relationships that our full communion partners have, and what that might mean or ought to imply for Canadian jurisdictions of those same churches, has brought the Moravian conversation to the fore in Canada in a new way. And so in early 2021, a working group between the Anglican Church in Canada, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, and the Canadian district of the Moravian Church was struck with a mandate to expand the Waterloo Declaration into a trilateral recognition of full communion relationships, and a draft agreement that is being called One Flock, One Shepherd, the Lamb Declaration, is set to come before councils of those three churches for their consideration over the next year. And I'll just draw your attention to the Lamb Declaration is LAM, so you can see what we did there. Lutheran, Anglican, Moravian, shepherds, flocks, you get it. So that brings me to my two friends, Reverend Danielle and Reverend James. Ecumenical movement, of course, sometimes occurs in part, at least, through actions from the top down, but far more often, and I think definitely essentially, it needs to rely on energy and initiative pushing from the bottom up. And it just so happens that Edmonton is kind of a relative greenhouse, I guess you could say, for these kinds of new shoots with Moravians. And rather than have me talk about that, I'm going to pick the brains of two folks who are living in the midst of it, and just ask each of these two colleagues a couple of questions about their own experience to give this dialogue and this relationship some faces and help bring it to life for us. And so I have two questions to put to both Danielle and James, and I'm going to start with Danielle. I'm just inviting some thoughts on what your experience has been, Danielle, in terms of ecumenical relationships between Anglicans and Moravians and Lutherans as well, locally in the Edmonton area, and how you think that's influenced some of this progress that I was talking about nationally.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me to speak on this. Ecumenism is something that's really near and dear to my heart. And I was very fortunate. I walked into the parish that I'm at now 4 years ago, and they had already been living out the Waterloo Declaration quite wholeheartedly with our Lutheran partners that are across the street. And we have a really amazing ministerial lunch gathering that we all do weekly. And it was through meeting with our Lutheran siblings in Christ that we figured that our church, as well as their church, we were in need of someone to fulfill a children's ministry position. So we set about together looking for someone that perhaps our churches could share. So we wanted someone that was like-minded, that we could share well with and go back and forth with. And lo and behold, we had a wonderful applicant for this job that was a Moravian pastor. Needless to say, we thought she was absolutely amazing, and we hired her, and it started this amazing trilateral ministerial between our two churches, with learning about the Moravian faith and having different flares of all our different backgrounds coming together and working together. And it turned itself into this lovely big thing of sharing speakers with each other, having educational opportunities. We've been able to share and throw our net wider, and we discovered we had a Moravian church that was literally 3 blocks to the east that we didn't even know of. So we were able to start bigger ministerial gatherings where we all shared resources. We were able to help plan services together. We were able to vent, which is something often clergy and lay people need, a safe place to vent and chat. And it became this beautiful ecumenical friendship between all of us. And we wanted to do more shared ministries. So we started looking at what kind of joint services could we all as a huge community do together. And we started doing longest night services together. We've done Remembrance Day services together. And then COVID hit, and we didn't want to stop the momentum of this beautiful 3 churches coming together thing. So we started sharing morning prayer, midday prayer, and evening prayers with all 3 denominations, where we would all share on our own individual pages, and with our congregations, we'd be able to share the Moravian evening prayer. We'd do Lutheran midday prayer and Anglican morning prayer. And it was a beautiful, authentic thing to watch flourish, where all three congregations got to know each other online over Zoom during these beautiful prayer sessions. And this amazing relationship just got stronger and established between parishes we didn't know existed, people we were so curious to learn more about. And it's established beautiful relationships going forward. And we absolutely love how this has worked even on the national ground, because we've heard from all of our congregations that when they see it ground level in their parish, they're able to see big picture national way better. And we've been able to have amazing conversations and speakers and information sessions on the weekend about these ecumenical endeavors. And it's been one of the most beautiful and most fulfilling things for me personally and for the congregation here where I'm at.
Thanks so much, Danielle. James, what about your experience of the relationships in the Edmonton area?
Well, thanks, Scott, also for that earlier survey. Well done. I'm not originally from Edmonton, like many Edmontonians, and I came to Edmonton about 8 years ago from Eastern Pennsylvania, where I was serving in a church, and I also grew up there in the Poconos, Pennsylvania. And while in Pennsylvania, while serving a parish, I developed some wonderful ecumenical colleagues in our full communion partners there, the ELCA and the Episcopal Church. And in communities, I found wonderful collegiality with my full communion partners. And when I was called here to Edmonton, the first thing I did, well, not the first thing I did, but pretty shortly after, was reach out to ecumenical partners, most notably the Anglican Church next door and the Lutheran Church across the street, kind of thing. And I was well received by my colleagues there, and they helped me to kind of feel a sense of grounding in this new place, and I felt a little less alone in ministry in this place that I was not very familiar with. So I have really fond feelings for my Anglican and Lutheran colleagues who were there in those initial days for helping to welcome me. Now the Anglican connection has really grown. I've been finding, particularly through Scott. Scott has been a wonderful steward of these ecumenical opportunities. And so a couple things have been growing. I like this green shoots, new shoots metaphor. A couple things have been growing in the Edmonton area that I've had the privilege of sort of watching or participating in. I know there's been a wonderful local coordinating group, folks who are interested in ecumenical shared ministry between the Moravians, Anglicans, and Lutherans in the Edmonton region. And that group has been meeting a couple times a year for conversation and coffee and all that kind of wonderful thing, but it's been supporting a much larger vision. So a couple pretty concrete examples of ecumenical work that we've been undertaking. We've been doing some shared youth ministry. We have a camp, there's a Moravian church camp called Camp Venice that I've learned about 20 years ago was also shared by the Anglicans, and then that sort of went in a different direction. But it's been wonderful to see Anglicans and Moravian kids together at our camps over the last about 4 years, pandemic in the middle. The St. Timothy's Anglican Church, which is a 5-minute walk from my parish building. We've undertaken some joint book studies. We've invited our Anglican and Lutheran friends to support shared community building projects, VBS at the Lutheran Church, charity fundraiser for anti-poverty work at my congregation, well supported by the Anglicans. And I think that these sorts of things are helping. My personal vision for ministry is very neighborhood oriented and place based, and so you have to know your neighbor to love your neighbor. And I think that having some friendly faces among Anglicans and Lutherans has been a really great opportunity for my congregation to say, oh, you other people aren't so bad. It's been a lovely experience. And I think that in the global kind of conversations around ecumenism, it's often about weighty kind of matters, but I think that there's a lot to be said about the importance of real relationships with friends. And I've been so grateful for authentic relationships with Anglican and Lutheran colleagues. It really helps to transform ministry from, sorry, I'm getting off track here, but those real tangible relationships have been very meaningful to me. And I know that they will have the possibility to provide a sense of purpose and place to others who participate in this process.
Awesome, thanks, James. So just in a minute or two each, if you can, you've told us a little bit about some of the stuff that's been ongoing for a few years and the fruit that it's already beginning to bear locally in the Edmonton area. But I wonder if you could comment on what benefits you see, what would be added for the local relationships that you could do together more fully or more effectively if there was a national Anglican, Lutheran, and Moravian full communion agreement. Danielle?
I think the first thing that sticks out to me is shared resources. There is such a breadth of amazing skills among all of our siblings in Christ, and to be able to actually share those with one another openly would be, I know at least to me, would be a huge blessing. I think even outside of sharing clergy and lay people and doing pulpit switches, I look at our liturgy. We used the I believe it was called A Walk Through Holy Week, which is a Moravian book that is for Holy Week. We used it in our parish here this year because it is one of the most beautiful liturgies. I look at all the shared resources we have. We have so much. We all have so much to offer. And if we're able to just swap them back and forth freely, I just think of the amazing things that can be happening. But I think the most important thing that is a local benefit is, and James touched on it, it's that authentic relationships. We are people of relationships. We want to know our siblings in Christ. We want to all be one. And I think, why put any barrier that could prevent that when we could be absolutely amazing all together? And I have made some of the best friendships in these ministerial groups, and our congregations have fallen in love with each other. And I just think going forward, I think more of that would make this whole world just a much better place.
Thank you. James, how about you? What would be added? What further fruit could come, perhaps?
Yeah, it's probably fairly cliche now to remind folks that the pandemic has really sped up a lot of global trends that are taking place. And I think that the church is really truly at least in Edmonton, is really truly at a bit of a crossroads. I think we've been given this wonderful opportunity to reconsider how we do church, why we do church, and what our witness and message can be. And I think that one of the things that people point to when they want to sort of delegitimize the church is to show how fractured it is. And these healing processes, I think, undergoing real authentic relationship in a global sense, I think will go a lot of way, both to show others that in fact we are on a healing journey just like everyone else, but also it reminds us that we're on a healing journey. We don't have all of the answers to every question that ever existed, right? And so I think in a global way, I think that this ecumenical work is important, because if we continue with this growth metaphor, it provides an opportunity for cross-pollination. And I think that increases our leadership capacity. You know, if we get so into our tunnel vision where, well, we do it the Moravian way because this is the way we've done it for 125 years here in Alberta, and realizing that there are 3 other partners who have also undergone their journeys, and that we have a lot to share. particularly, I think, in cultivating leadership capacity. And I also think that for the health of churches, we need to be thinking about how we plant new ministry expressions. What will new ministry expressions look like in this post-pandemic world? And does it even make sense for us to do it as a solo church? I truly believe that future ministry expressions should be very intentional about doing them collaboratively with our full communion partners.
Wonderful. So thank you both to Reverend Danielle and Reverend James for joining today and animating the conversation from your own personal experience. We're at the time that we've been given, and I want to pass it over to my colleague, Dr. Ryan Weston, who will talk about kind of the other side, perhaps, or two sides of the same coin of our national ecumenical work. So Ryan, over to you.
Thanks, Scott. Scott and Danielle and James took exactly the amount of time they said they would, so I guess I'd better really stick to mine as well. I'm going to share my screen, God willing, and it should all go. So thanks to everyone for the invitation to join you today, a part of this event. As Scott mentioned, my name is Ryan Weston, and I am a staff person at the General Synod Office, and speaking to you today from the territory of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat people on lands covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum in Toronto. And I'm happy to be on this panel with my friends and colleagues here. I know there have been discussion. I mean, I'm sorry to wow you with my graphic skills right off the top here. I thought the internet would provide me a better image than this, but it didn't really. I know there's been discussions today about global context, and that tomorrow there'll be discussions about local context. And I just want to begin my portion today, perhaps stating the obvious, that in reality, the local, national, and global are all connected and constantly feeding into and informing one another, as again, beautifully evidenced here in this visual aid that I've developed. This is particularly true in social and ecological justice concerns, where these issues might manifest differently in these different areas, but they cannot be strictly separated. You know, climate change is not just a global issue, not just a local issue. It is in fact at all of these levels. So I'm focusing on today on the National Ecumenical Justice Ministries for my presentation, but these ministries are deeply connected to and strengthened by what is happening at the grassroots level on these lands and around the world. It's happening. I'll leave it to others, perhaps involved in other parts of this conference, to make the very important theological case for why Christians should engage in ecumenical conversations. And today I want to suggest to you that ecumenical engagement on justice issues is also just extremely practical at all levels of engagement, and particularly in my experience at the national level. Again, working together with siblings in faith towards shared objectives based on fundamental shared principles and beliefs can make this work more effective. As the overall influence of the church, and particularly mainline denominations, wanes in many parts of Canada, ecumenical collaboration can amplify key ideas and messages, increase the reach of initiatives and resources, and nurture important networks of support and solidarity to help sustain ongoing efforts together. This collaboration is not always easy. Despite a shared faith in the good news of Jesus Christ, we all know that Christians can find any number of things to disagree about. I know many of you came through seminary that are here today, so you would know that better than most, I think. And often these disagreements can be in quite significant ways. So working for justice ecumenically requires a willingness to compromise, a commitment to identify shared priorities or specific points of connection, and the ability to recognize when, despite everyone's best efforts, you just aren't going to be able to move forward on something at this point, that the differences are just too great. It can be challenging, but navigating these challenges can be richly rewarding and, once again, effective on a practical level. And here are some of the impacts listed here that can come out of the kind of ecumenical justice discussions that are happening and get translated into our shared work. The conversation today is focused on new shoots, but I want to recognize some of the longstanding ways that the Anglican Church of Canada and other denominations have been involved in ecumenical social justice efforts for decades in Canada. I tried to keep to the new shoots metaphor and started calling it old shoots, but that didn't quite feel right. And I tried to work a couple of other things, but I think I was stretching it too much. So I just went with long-standing relationships and dropped the metaphor completely. But just to highlight that there's ongoing work that our partners and that we are members of the Church Council for Justice and Corrections, Kairos, the Commission on Justice and Peace of the Canadian Council of Churches, and Project Plowshares are just some of the examples here. I could also include our full communion partners in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, who have already been mentioned, as they have been a key justice partner for many years as well. And although these are all well-established relationships and with well-established networks, there does continue to be new shoots of action and engagement at all of these tables as they consider the changing state of their key focus areas. But along with these established relationships, I want to give a bit more space to some truly new shoots developing nationally around ecumenical engagement for social and ecological justice over the last few years. Many of these new shoots are connected to or grew out of the networks established and mentioned already in our longstanding relationships, but are working toward a particular focus or goal that results in either broader or narrower participation and membership, depending on different denominations' comfort level or capacity. The first new shoot I want to highlight is the International Decade for People of African Descent. The decade is a global initiative of the United Nations system beginning in 2015 to recognize that people of African descent represent a distinct group whose human rights must be promoted and protected. This includes addressing anti-Black racism. In 2020, following an invitation from the United Church of Canada to the Anglican Church of Canada and the Evangelical Lutheran Church, these three denominations together declared our commitment to lifting up the decade and pursuing the principles of recognition, justice, and development for peoples of African descent in Canada and around the world. I'll note that we got there about halfway through the decade. We were 5 years in, so we were late starters to this, but have I hope are picking up some momentum in the remaining years of this work. Following this commitment, these three denominations, using the mechanisms of the Canadian Council of Churches, invited participation from all interested member denominations willing to engage in this work, resulting in several traditions coming together for shared conversation, for the creation of public events and commemorations, and the identification of folks interested in continuing an engagement on the issues highlighted by the decade. And some of those folks are actually meeting tomorrow to discern what their next steps are and how they proceed for the next couple of years together on this work. The second new shoot is the work of the Faith in the Declaration Coalition. Faith in the Declaration brings together several denominations and faith-based organizations as part of a response to Call to Action number 48 from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. Call to Action 48 calls upon quote, the church parties to the settlement agreement and all other faith groups and interfaith social justice groups in Canada who have not already done so to formally adopt and comply with the principles, norms, and standards of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a framework for reconciliation, and to engage in ongoing public dialogue and actions to support the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So Faith in the Declaration engages in advocacy and awareness raising among the membership of the various participating denominations and entities, and with Canadians generally wanting to continue the journey towards reconciliation with the peoples of these lands and waters by calling on the Government of Canada to adopt the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as a framework for reconciliation and to implement the principles of the Declaration in Canadian law. And a bill was passed to this effect in Parliament in June of 2021, thanks to the advocacy and efforts of many folks, particularly Indigenous leadership around this, but that certainly this has been a part of that ongoing work together. A third new shoot is the For the Love of the Creation campaign for climate justice. One of the initial seeds for this work was planted during a meeting of representatives of various Christian denominations with the then Federal Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Catherine McKenna, in 2019. This meeting was to discuss how faith communities could engage on issues of climate change and climate justice in Canada. Following this meeting, including actually immediately following when she left the room, the conversation started and carried on in ongoing discussions and discernment that invited additional folks who were not present at that initial meeting, discussion about how we might continue to work collaboratively towards shared commitments around ecological justice. And these discussions resulted in the creation of the For the Love of Creation as a national network working to mobilize education, reflection, advocacy, and action for climate justice. For the Love of Creation launched publicly on Earth Day 2020 and has since invited people across Canada to participate in a number of activities and initiatives for climate justice. And recently this network has moved toward trying to establish more of an interfaith engagement, which has led to a whole other series of questions and conversations that need to happen in good ways. And the final new shoot I'll highlight today is truly a new shoot, as it is very much in a nascent stage. In fact, it may develop into something completely different than what I am about to describe to you. But for now, there is a growing discussion about how Canadian churches might come alongside migrants and migrant-serving organizations in the possible establishment of a Churches Witnessing with Migrants Canada network. Churches Witnessing with Migrants International is a global initiative established in 2008 with primary early leadership from the National Council of Churches in the Philippines. In recent years, Churches Witnessing with Migrants has worked to establish regional networks to engage issues within their respective home countries or regions. In responding to these initiatives to establish regional networks, some Canadian denominations and organizations who participate in the global Churches Witnessing with Migrants began discussing the possibility of establishing such a network in Canada. And following an invitation circulated widely among Canadian ecumenical contacts involved in a wide range of ministries related to migrant work, including support for migrant workers, refugee resettlement, and human trafficking. An initial meeting was held in March 2020. As it happens, it was on the day that the WHO declared a global pandemic, so I remember it very well. And the United Church had branded hand sanitizer. It's not it, I remember it from that meeting. So they met in March 2020 to discuss the state of migrant-related ministries and to discern whether there might be interest in moving together toward the creation of a Churches Witnessing with Migrants Canada network. These conversations continue and have expanded to include grassroots migrants and migrant-serving organizations, both of which are actually integral to the Churches Witnessing with Migrants structure. So you can't actually be a CWWM if it's just churches and no migrant-serving organizations. It is in fact part of the package. So the conversations continue with those organizations as well as folks in other networks in North America and with the international network as well. The ultimate shape of these may be something quite different from what it is now, but the relationships and networks that have been established are already proving fruitful for collaboration and knowledge sharing. As a denomination, the Anglican Church of Canada has its own initiatives and efforts related to all of these and many other issues of social and ecological justice. Ecumenical efforts don't replace these efforts, but instead complement and strengthen the work of Anglicans and so many others to pursue justice on earth as it is in heaven. We are lucky to have some capacity to do things ourselves if we need to, but we are blessed to be able to work collaboratively across denominations to improve outcomes and do more than we can ask or imagine on our own. Ecumenical justice efforts to continue to grow and adapt as we consider new questions or consider old questions in new ways, and remain the most effective opportunity to bring Christian witness to these vitally important issues. So before I go, just to recap some of the key ideas for me in considering the ecumenical movements for social and ecological justice. First is to reiterate that ecumenical collaboration for justice issues just makes sense. It is the biggest bang for our buck, so to speak, and so that makes it an important option to pursue in this work. Second, to remind all of us that sometimes ecumenism is difficult. Scott has heard me say this many times. We may not always find common ground, or we may have to compromise on something we hold to be very important, Or as I've already said, sometimes we may even have to decide to walk separately for the time being as we each continue our discernment and reflection. Challenges, however, are not failures. They are just part of the work that we are undertaking together. And finally, a reminder that despite the challenges we face, ecumenism can be deeply enriching in our shared work for justice. Learning from and challenging one another creates opportunities for new insight, new energy, and new ideas. Being open to these new things allows for all kinds of possibilities to develop, and I, for one, can't wait to see what's next. Thanks.
Thank you to our speakers, our panelists here, and the various thoughts that they brought us this afternoon. And we have some time at this point to open up the discussion. And if there are questions from those who have joined us from across Canada, please, if you'd like to put them in the chat, and then I can pose them to whoever you would like to pose them to particularly, or to the panel in general. And I begin also with if there's any particular questions that the panelists would like to ask each other. If there are any comments as you are listening to each other, how your works intersect, both in terms of social justice and those authentic relationships we were hearing about, that they were being built at the local level. How does that work come together as we continue to move into this sort of new shoots in ecumenism? If anybody wanted to speak to that.
I can try and say something about that. Happy to hear what others might think too. Yeah, so I think it's true that there's always been, during the history of the ecumenical movement, this kind of sense of a few different streams that are not exactly the same, but intersect at certain times and mutually inform one another, or sometimes feel like they're at odds with one another and have been in tension. There's different ups and downs in that story over time. And I definitely, you see it reflected just in the fact of this presentation today and in the way we currently structure staffing, that the Anglican Church of Canada seems to acknowledge that there's a distinction between kind of Ryan's portfolio and my portfolio, and I think we try relatively hard to break down the silos of those two worlds, but they are there sometimes, and we need to actively communicate with each other, because there have been times where Ryan's doing something that would be really great for me to know about in conversation with a partner, or where I'm talking about something that would be really essential to something he's working on and we don't hear about it. So there is a need to kind of, I think, understand that there can be a differentiation of entry points into the ecumenical movement, but there is one ecumenical movement that has different dimensions. And I've certainly experienced that oftentimes it is the grassroots local desire of followers of Jesus who want to respond to needs in their world or needs in their community that call them together in order to try to work in the name of the gospel to meet the needs of people who are suffering or in need. And then the questions of, okay, could we be doing this more or in a different way if some of the barriers and obstacles around our polity and our structures and our doctrines could be seen differently? And so there's sort of a swing back and forth sometimes where the action side pushes reflection on doctrine and governance. And then when we free up some new ways of thinking about or make some decisions that allow for new creativity or new kinds of partnership, then that opens new doors to different kinds of justice engagement and mission and ministry in the world. So I like to think about them as two sides of the same coin, not separate, differentiated, but together.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to say something there? If not, then there is a question in the chat for Ryan, and the question is, what have been some of the harder ecumenical work that you've done in social justice, and when you've been working ecumenically, and how have you been able to sort of continue working even in the midst of those difficulties? Perhaps you could share some of those experiences.
Sure. Yeah, how much time do we have? No, I enjoy lots about ecumenism, and there are lots of things that I find challenging, and I think particularly in the justice work. So I'm thinking of at the Commission on Justice and Peace for the Canadian Council of Churches, for example, there is long-standing discussion around issues of Palestine and Israel and the peace in the Holy Land. And I'll say there has not ever been, in my experience of that, any movement towards here's where we're going. We all are on the same page about this issue, and we're going to get to it. And that has been frustrating in those conversations, often for other folks who want everybody on board to say, here's what we're going to do, here's what we're going to say. So to recognize that that's a space where we want to keep talking about it and hear about it, but that we're not necessarily working toward at this point some kind of agreement that everybody can get on. And another example from the Commission on Justice and Peace is that we have a focus on healing poverty there, and I don't want to get into a whole healing poverty discussion about that terminology, but actually in the work that has happened around there's been a whole discussion about poverty and people's sort of theological understandings of poverty and what that implies and what it means, and does that necessarily then make poverty a bad thing, something that needs to be healed and dealt with. And I find that very challenging, because I am really interested in the result. I am interested in the outcome, in the betterment. So I think we did have good conversation around that. We worked through it together to get to a place where we could continue to move forward. But I found that surprising and quite challenging to work with when it came up. I thought, are you kidding? We're just not talking about the same thing, but we had to actually figure out a way to talk about the same thing. And I carry on because it's my job, I guess. But, and because sometimes we get somewhere, right? There are times still, and sometimes it takes 5 years, but there are times where we get somewhere together, and that's quite a wonderful thing.
Great, thank you. So there was another question in the chat. Are there any generational dynamics at play in ecumenism? This individual was noting that given our churches, all of you are fairly young compared to the average age of churches. And so that was a very encouraging sign. So just a question in terms of generations. Are various generations more interested in ecumenism or working together with other Christians or sisters and brothers together? Anyway, I'll just open that.
I would say it depends, in my experience, on kind of the grassroots here. I find our older generations very much want to have hospitality hours first with the other denominations. They want to sit and have coffee and tea and chat. Whereas I've discovered a lot of what I would say, if I'm going to really paint a generational picture, if I say the under 50 crowd, they want to meet where we're going to do it and try it. And then we'll meet and talk about it and figure out what we did wrong and what we need to do better. Whereas our older generation wants to meet, sit, and discuss what could possibly go wrong, to kind of premeditate those whoopsies when you're actually out on the field. And they're both vitally important and needed, but very hard to have at the same time. So quite often, I think we're bouncing between, we're going to sit and plan this out to the T versus we're just going to throw our boots on and run and see what happens. Either way, everyone's always laughing at the end, which is good, but there's very different, at least for me here, different approaches to ecumenism based on what generations want to participate in it.
This might be going in the wrong direction, but at the summer camp, Camp Venice, we did a joint Anglican and Moravian winter retreat in, I think it was probably 2019. And there were probably 20 Moravians and 20 Anglican youth. And they were having a great time all together. Like it wasn't like we were all on the same page in terms of the program and activities and all this kind of stuff. But then it came to the evening prayer time, you know, that campfire time at the end of the day. The Moravians, we call it Vespers, which I acknowledge is not the appropriate terminology. And the Anglicans call it Compline, which is actually the proper terminology. And they're basically the exact same thing, gathering around a fire, offering prayers, singing, and just generally enjoying some quiet time together. But these kids were like at odds with each other over, well, they're doing it slightly different from us. You know, that it was very funny and endearing. Some of the most conservative people, I suppose, are teenagers. But generally speaking, my experience has been similar to Danielle's, where I think that the younger approaches to ecumenism tends to be much more pragmatic. But I could imagine there are some personality differences there as well.
Thanks very much. Ryan, in terms of your work with various groups, is there a generational difference, or
That's
it's
a good question. I'll first say one thing I love about being in the church is that I still get referred to as a young person. It is wonderful. It doesn't happen anywhere else, so I'll take it where I can get it. But yeah, I think there probably is. I don't know a lot about. I don't ascribe to a lot of generational thinking, but I think there probably is. And even when Scott was talking earlier about this being the 20th anniversary of the Waterloo Declaration, like that is a generations of people that have grown up in a church that has the Waterloo Declaration. Now, some of them may never have heard of it or been impacted, but some will have grown up in particular relationships because of that. And so I think there's just a different sort of set of experiences that folks have accumulated, and those of us in the, as Danielle said, the 50 and under crowd, which I think is a lot of like the growing up in the post-Christendom kind of world, that we have a different experience of interacting with the various ministries and resources that are available. That there might just be one youth group in the church down the street that's not yours, but you're going to go to it because that's the thing. Like I think there's a different kind of relationship that folks have, and that not that denominational identifiers aren't important, but that there are ways that they have learned flexibility that, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much. Thank you. And a final question in the chat here, perhaps this would be one for Scott to answer. Someone was asking about relationships with Lutherans beyond the ELCIC. Other Lutherans that are not within the covenant relationship, are there possibilities for dialogue with them, or are there any ways to reach out, and just where are we around that?
Yeah, well, interesting question. So certainly there are other jurisdictions of Lutherans in Canada, just as there are other jurisdictions of Anglicans in Canada. And that can complicate the picture when you talk about Anglican Lutheran or Anglican Roman Catholic. Which people are in the room? Who are you referring to? So yes, many communities across Canada will have a Lutheran Church Canada as one of the dominant other Lutheran jurisdictions that's present here. There's others as well. I mean, I think probably to a certain extent, it would depend on the openness of those partners to want to engage ecumenically with you as an Anglican or as a member of a different church. Oftentimes, some jurisdictions of Lutherans can be quite resistant to certain kinds of ecumenical relationships as part of their self-understanding as church. And so that can be a complication. But that doesn't mean that nothing is possible. I think we're called into the fullest degree of friendship and relationship and learning that we can with other people who say they are followers of Jesus Christ. So, I mean, I think if there's interest in getting to know one another and talk with one another and do some things in community together, then why wouldn't you explore those possibilities? There would likely be some serious limitations around things like recognizing ministries and sacraments and certain practices of the church that wouldn't be possible to contemplate sharing at that kind of a level. But it doesn't mean it's a complete non-starter. So
right. But there aren't any new shoots there at all at this point that you know of.
So there aren't any active national conversations with Lutheran Church Canada, but the Roman Catholic Church in Canada has a dialogue with the LCC, and there have been occasions where Anglicans have been invited to attend and observe some of those conversations. There have been attempts by the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada to have at least occasional meetings with other Lutheran leaders, and we hear about that from our ELCIC Lutheran colleagues. So I mean, there are points of occasional contact, but nothing that I would point to quite at the level of a new shoot, I guess you could say.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Well, I think that's our time. So thank you so much to our speakers, our panelists today, to Scott and Danielle and James and Ryan for wonderful insights that they have shared with us about what's happening in terms of new shoots across the country. Some exciting things happening in the local area there in Edmonton, and then in social justice across the country. And so it's really encouraging, and thank you for bringing us that encouragement, and also perhaps some of the challenges that continue to be before us and that we continue to pray and work for as we continue on this very important journey. So thank you to our panelists and speakers, and thank you to all the participants who have come along and shared in this session of our conference, and also those who have posed the questions to our panelists along the way. You'll remind you that we have 2 more sessions around different other issues at the conference tomorrow, particularly looking at the local level. And of course, in a few moments at 5:15, there will be Anglican Evensong, and then we look forward to Orthodox Vespers tomorrow at 5:15 as well. So thank you to everyone, and we look forward to seeing you all again tomorrow if you're able to come along. So thanks to everyone. Bye-bye for now. Bye.